So you'll know if you were listening to my debate with William Lane Craig that I didn't claim that the fine-tuning is brutally contingent. I claimed that it's necessary. And so it has exactly the same explanation in saying that the initial state exists of necessity, assuming that the values of the constants are determined at that point. They couldn't have been otherwise, right? That just falls out of what I've already committed myself to. So it's not an extra assumption that I need to make. So the idea that there's a brute contingency there, I think, is just mistaken. Of course, it could be that the fixing of the values of the constants happens at some non-initial point as a result of some process. In that case, on any view, it will turn out to be a brute contingency, and that's fine. But on the assumption that it's fixed in the initial state, whether it's fixed by God's preferences or it's fixed in the way that I imagine, it'll be necessary.
Okay, so let me respond to that, right? So, so you're saying that the fine-tuning is necessary, right? You're saying that it is determined, right? But I want to ask, right, determined by what? Because it has no cause, right? Because it has a beginning and no cause, right? So as I illustrated using my house building analogy, right? If my house begin to exist uncaused, then there's no cause that makes it the case that it is a house rather than a pile of rubble, right? So on your view, there is no cause, right, that makes it necessary, right? It just began necessarily, right? But,
okay, so let me do the same thing. On your view, God exists of necessity. But what's the cause, right? You don't need causes for necessities.
Yeah, in the case of God, there's no need because, as I said, God exists beginninglessly, right? So something that is beginningless is always, has always been like that, right? Because it's beginningless, right? So given that it's beginningless, what beginningless means is that it has always been like that. That's what beginningless means, right? And so that means that it has always been like that. That means that it is necessary because it couldn't have been otherwise. It has always been like that, right? So on my view, right, that based on there is an explanation for why is it that God exists uncaused and the way it is, right? Why God exists necessarily. Whereas on your view, there is no such reason. No such reason can be offered, right?
So you're saying there's an infinite regress in the case of God. There's no beginning, right? So pick any state, there's a state before it, because if there isn't a state before it, then it's a beginning. So there's an infinite regress. So we've now gone back to somewhere near the beginning, and you've taken back one of the premises of your argument.
Oh, no, Graham, I think you are mistaken, because having no beginning doesn't imply an infinite regress. Why? Because there are various possibilities. There are various possible things which can have no beginning, right? So another possibility of something which has no beginning is something which is timeless or initially changeless, as I argued, right? So if something is initially changeless, then there is no infinite regress of change. There's no infinite regress of temporal moments, for example. And so if something is timeless, then it has no beginning, because beginning refers to something that happens in time. Beginning refers to something that has finite temporal extent, right? So if God is timeless, then he has no temporal extent, and therefore he has no beginning. So it is not the case that by saying that God exists beginninglessly, it is not the case that I'm committed to the view of an infinite regress, which we agreed, right? That cannot be the case.
So I think that when you said changeless, you must mean there's some extension over which the thing doesn't change. It's irrelevant that it's not temporal. What matters is that it's an extension, right? If there was just a single point, then there's no sense to be made of the notion of it's not changing if we've just got a single moment, right? But then the position would be no different from mine. You would just have moved back one extra thing that you would have added on at the beginning, one extra step. But there's clearly an implication of duration when you're talking about changelessness. Once you've got duration, we can ask, what's its measure? And you've got two possible answers. Either it's finite or it's infinite. If it's infinite, you've got regress and you've given up one of your earlier premises. If it's finite, it's got a beginning and you don't have beginninglessness, right? You can't even make sense of the notion of changelessness without a duration over which there is no change. You can't say there's just a point and the thing was changeless, because nothing changes at a point, right? You've got to have something that's measurable.
Okay, no, that is wrong actually, because now by a point is something within a dimension, right? But what I'm saying is that God is not in any dimension, right? God is not in any dimension or time, and therefore God is initially changeless. So by saying initially changeless, I'm not committed to the view that God exists within a duration which exists within a dimension. In fact, I'm denying it. I'm saying that there's no dimension where God exists changelessly without any dimension, without any not in any point, but there is beyond any dimension. That's what I mean by God. So by saying that God is changeless, I am not committed to a duration.
This sounds to me like as though the notion of being changeless isn't now doing any work, because what you just said, I think, was that if God's beyond any dimension, the notion of change, as with lots of other notions, is going to have no application.